Hello everyone, it is I, Vought of Paint. This week I give you a sort of part 2 to my watercolour postcard testing video from a few weeks ago. To remind you which brands of postcards I'm testing, we are going to have the Watercolour Postcards Aquarelle with 250 grams per meter square in the top left, the Ami Aquarelle Postkarten with 300 grams per meter square in the bottom left, and to the right we will have Van Gogh's Watercolour Postcards with 300 grams per meter squared. They are all A6 and Ami has the beautiful rounded corners that I do kind of love. Heads up, however, I managed to get the Ami postcard the wrong way round, so when I flip it later in the video, it's upside down. It's all on me, I taped it down the wrong way round. And yes, this time I taped down the Watercolour and the Ami postcards simply to see if I like them more with a sort of white border, because I need them stuck down well, for I will be using wet and wet on them quite a bit in this video. So, to start off with, I wet each of the cards one by one and add a dot of permanent rose from Winsor Newton flower palette in about the middle. After wetting them, you may notice that the Watercolour and the Ami postcards are both buckling in the same way, with one big hump in the middle, like a tiny mini hill. The Van Gogh postcard is buckling a lot more wavily. Now, for this video, I decided to let you guys see as much of the drying process as possible, because I think, one, watching watercolour spread, especially sped up, is kind of satisfying to watch. And I wanted you guys to be sure I wasn't like playing any tricks or something, like adding paint in post or something. With the Watercolour, it took me a few tries at first with the dot of rose because I was a little too timid, but when I finally added a big dot of paint, I got some very, very nice spreading, so should have just done that from the start. The Ami card, however, didn't feel like letting the paint spread out all that much, at least that's how I felt it was happening. So we got a little tiny spread out dot that has some like feathery texture to it. The dot on the Van Gogh card stayed the roundest of them all. It was almost a complete perfect circle, although I have to say that it dried oddly. Hence why you see me pointing towards those circles occasionally as I'm explaining the difference to my dear sister who was walking past. Upon first impressions, I like the way that the colour spreads on the Watercolour the most, because it is not only the sort of broadest spread but also the most interesting of the three cards. The first one dry, surprisingly, was the Van Gogh card, followed by the Ami card, and the Watercolour card took the longest. So if you are painting something purely wet and need to add as much colour during the wet stage as possible, Watercolour has got you covered, but you're all going to have to bear in mind that it is quite warm here at the moment, at least for Irish standards, so that might also have something to do with the paint drying quickly. As soon as the three of them were dry though, I wet them all again to see how much of the paint would reactivate again. The Van Gogh actually reactivated the most, at least that's what I felt like, probably because it dried so oddly. However, all three of them reactivated the paint very little, and so I felt confident putting down more colourful dots around the cards. Ultramarine in the top left, cadmium red deep hue in the top right, lemon yellow hue in the bottom right, and dioxazine purple in the bottom left. You can see that since the cards are already buckling, the paint is flowing a little bit differently on each one, which is kind of what I wanted to see, how that's going to affect the spreading. On the Watercolour and the Ami card, it tended to flow downwards more than anywhere else, so it kind of spread out to the corners of the postcards, which is fine, you know. In the top right corner of the Watercolour, the cadmium red ended up flowing just straight to the side rather than spreading in all directions like I had wanted it to. The lemon yellow dot in the Ami card didn't spread a lot, as the paper had dried up right next to it by the time I put down the paint. Again, it's very warm here, so that might just be a temperature thing, but it was a little bit disappointing that that happened just as I put down the paint. But that's why the yellow dot is going to be the last one I'm going to work on the Ami card, because it just didn't want to dry in time. Oh well, eventually it did sort of dry, but I kind of ended up losing my patience in the end. So that is the last one that's going to be turned into a flower. Speaking of which, that is the first thing I do once everything is sufficiently dry again. I started with the blue leaf in the corner, going over it with more ultramarine in order to define the shape more. And then I mixed some dioxazine purple with the ultramarine in order to get a darker shade of blue, which I use as a shadow around the leaf and also to add that little bit like that sort of vein that plants have. Then I move on to the pink flower and define 2 petals, one on top and one on the bottom of the flower, mainly because that's just kind of what it looked like to me, like sort of like a 2-petal flower. For the flower in the top right corner, I use a slightly thicker mix of cadmium red to define the petals and add some cadmium yellow in the middle of it, since that was still white and it kind of looked like it would be the perfect middle for a flower. The purple flower down in the bottom left-hand corner also gets the petals defined a little, and I shade the yellow petal slightly before I decided that it didn't look complete, so I added some smaller petals next to it in cadmium yellow just to make it look more like a flower rather than some leaf like the blue one is. I do something similar with each of the other 2 cards, with the main differences being the shapes of the flowers, which are largely dependent on how the paint flowed on the postcards during the wet and wet stage. On the ME card, the flower in the middle gets 3 instead of 2 petals, and I don't paint the yellow one until it is almost dry. Admittedly, I lost my patience with it towards the end. It just wouldn't dry fully, and I didn't feel like messing with it by taking away the excess paint. But in the end, I was left with no choice but to mess with it because I didn't feel like waiting for it anymore. On the Van Gogh card, 3 of the flowers are the same ones with 5 petals, and those are the one that was done with ultramarine, the one with cadmium, and the one that was done with a permanent rose. Unfortunately, also on the Van Gogh card, I accidentally put my arm into the purple paint while I was painting flowers on a different card. I tried to rectify that mistake by putting some paint over it, but in the end it was just very, very dark. Now, bear in mind, obviously, that's my error, not the paper's error. The paper is not responsible for me putting my arm into the paint. And also, these tests don't just rely on the quality of the paper, but also on the skill of the person painting, which is me. So even if I am good at painting flowers, I am very annoyed with myself for having almost ruined this by putting my arm in the wrong spot. Anyways, I think that's happened to every artist ever, at one point at least. If we don't get paint on ourselves, are we even artists? I just realized digital artists exist. Anyways, for the yellow dot on the Van Gogh card, I decided not to turn it into a 5-petal flower like the blue, pink and orange flower on it already were. I just didn't feel like doing the same thing, which technically maybe I could have done it because it was also as round as the other ones, so I could have just done the same thing, but I kind of didn't feel like it. I kind of wanted to have at least some variation of flowers on there, so I decided to take some cadmium yellow and draw a bunch of lines across the yellow dot in order to turn it into a dandelion. It was just too perfect not to do, okay? I really like dandelions, so I kind of felt like I needed at least one in this video. Now, once all of them have their flowers, except for Ami, which still has the yellow flower to be painted, I add in leaves all over the postcards because I kind of feel like, when you've got flowers, you need to have leaves. So for the Ami and the Hanemühle postcard, I added in a few leaves around each flower. On the Van Gogh, however, since 3 flowers were identical except for the colour, I ended up adding so many leaves that in the end it just kind of looks a little bit like the 3 flowers that have the 5 petals are in like a sort of bush, which I kind of do like. It's very nice, but it's also very different from the other cards because of that. And I also kind of wanted to make it look cohesive, and so that's where the bush came from. So the top left corner of the painting ended up having quite a few more shadows, while the bottom right was still pretty light, which I think looks very cool, to be honest. Some of the flowers also get some nice stamen. I googled this, but for the stem thingies, the little stem fingers with the dots on the end, they get those poking out of them, as I thought it would make these kinds of made up flowers look more real, like maybe somewhere they might exist. Anyways, the pink flowers on the Hanemühle and the Ami card also get some stems, as well as the purple flower on the Hanemühle card, and obviously the dandelion in the Van Gogh card. And they also get some pointy leaves. Eventually I do add a sort of slightly dandelion-y looking leaf to the dandelion, or like right next to it, just because I felt that side needed just a tiny little bit more in that area, because the top bit of it was already so full and so busy that the bit just looked a little empty there. Now for shading the leaves, I mixed the sap green I used for them with the cadmium red Deep Hue or ultramarine blue, and sometimes I had to lighten it up again with some lemon yellow in order to paint in new leaves as well. And the palette is quite small, so mixing separate greens was a little challenging for me, and that's why you see me mixing so many different greens this time around, because I was adding so many leaves, and sometimes I looked at it and I went like, I can add another leaf here, and maybe let's go with another leaf here, and this could be a bit darker, but then I need more light green because, I don't know, there's some leaves missing here and I need more there, and this needs a different kind of colour shading, and it was just all a little bit messy, I suppose. But in the end, they all look very, very nice, I think, so it's all worth it. I also should mention that I didn't pay a lot of attention to making the colours match, simply because the focus of this test was the wet and how the paint acted on each paper, how well it flowed, what sort of kind of was going on, if it was blooming or getting this weird kind of drying that it got from the Van Gogh, and the focus was not if the colour was right or not. Also, I want to mention that while painting the Van Gogh card, I did notice that the corner, not stuck to the rest of the block, was lifting up quite a bit, which obviously didn't happen with the other postcards because I had taped them down very well, but in the end, I mean, it didn't really annoy me, I just noticed that it was lifting off the paper, and so I was a little bit scared because maybe if I wasn't careful enough, which I was very careful, but I was scared to get paint on the postcard below it, which I didn't have to have with the other 2 postcards because they were stuck down and there was no other postcard underneath them. The only thing that was getting paint on it was the board I was using underneath to keep them stuck down. Maybe the tape was the thing that was affecting the way that each of the cards buckled, because even if the Van Gogh was stuck down on all 4 sides, it wasn't stuck down like in the same way that the Ami and the Hanemühle card was. I'm going to have to try and experiment with that a little bit, maybe see if I can get it to sort of buckle differently, because the wavy buckling was a little bit odd, to me at least. In either case, once each of them has dried on the top, I take off the tape, and this is where I am going to realize that the Ami card is the wrong way around. If I flip it over, the lines for the address are in the top left rather than the bottom right hand corner. It is a good thing I don't plan on sending these to anyone. That would be a little embarrassing, but I accidentally stuck the postcard down the wrong way. I also struggle a little bit while taking the Van Gogh card off the block. A part of me now understands why people tend to separate these papers with a crafting knife rather than being like me and doing this with a triangular protractor, because I have nothing else lying around near me that could work. I ended up having so much glue still stuck to the card that I first have to peel it all off before I can turn the card around in order to wet the back of it. In all honesty, that was very, very annoying to do. Anyways, I proceed to wet the back of each of the cards so that they have an easier time lying flat. And before they go in under the books, let me tell you what my conclusion about these postcards is. First up, the Hanemühle card. Now, lying moderately flat again, I like the many interesting flowers I got out of this one. The paint may not have spread uniformly, but it spread interestingly and in fun ways, and that makes this card very special to me. Second, the ME card, which is still a little buckly and that had the least spreading of the paint, which may be nice if you want to have some sort of controllable paint flow, but it didn't serve its purpose for this painting, if you ask me. The postcard still looks nice, and I do like the round edges, but otherwise I don't like this particular paper as much anymore. Lastly, we have the Van Gogh card, which gave me some very uniform circles of paint to work with, although it did dry a little weirdly at some times. Also, I should mention that while I removed it from the back, the black of the paper was ripped off a little, which makes it a little less appealing to me now. Skill-wise, however, I do prefer this card. I think out of all the three, my favourite is this one just because the flowers don't look so random, I suppose, and there's not such a huge difference in size between the flowers. Plus, the dark and light contrast is a really nice touch. I shall pat myself on the back for that one. So, now the video is at an end. Let's give you all another really good close look at the flowers before I end it. Make sure, of course, that you have subscribed to my channel, left a like underneath this video, and of course comment down below which one of these postcards is your favourite. I will once again try to leave links to where you can buy these postcards online down below. And do remember that this is not sponsored by any of these brands. These are postcard sets that either me or my mum has bought in a shop when we saw them. Also, if you're feeling like it, check out my Instagram, Twitter and Twitch account. And of course, have a lovely day everyone. I am the Witch of Paint and I shall see you all next Sunday. Bye! Oh, you made it to the end of the video. Well done. Let me reward you with some outtakes. To remind you which brands of postcards there, but first off doesn't need to be there. With 250 grams per meter squares on in the top left. Upon first impressions. And add some cadmium.